It is February 28th, 2025, and Israel is once again bombing Syria this week, specifically in southern Syria, claiming that they're working to set up a demilitarized zone there. Why, you may ask? Oh, it's because the new proxy government in Damascus, the one that is led by the guy who was formerly the leader of what was formerly Al-Qaeda, they all of a sudden started calling out Israel this week, and they started talking about Syrian territorial sovereignty. Seems like it's a little bit late for that, given everything that we've been through in the last 2.5 months following the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad. Notably, after that overthrow, the first thing that Israel did was it started bombing Syria, launching nearly 500 strikes in the first 48 hours all across the country, because their goal was to make sure that Syria could not defend itself. And now to watch this new government that was built and supported by Turkey in Damascus suddenly thinking they can call out Israel. Well, it's an interesting update that makes you look at the overall plan for Greater Israel, the overall plan to get Israel all the way to Damascus, and the fact that right now they currently have nothing stopping them. We also need to talk about just how involved the U.S. has been in getting us to this point. We've talked a lot about all of the infamous USAID funding, but just how much of it was going into Syria, aimed at overthrowing Assad, at controlling the media landscape there and also internationally, and forcing us to this point where Syria is no longer a sovereign country, and it's the Syrian people who continue to pay the price. We got into all of that and more with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Kevork Almassian, a geopolitical analyst and host of Syriana Analysis. Kevork, thank you so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, it's always good to have you on the show. And I'm looking forward to getting your analysis on the latest, because I've been watching Syria, watching as this former ISIS and Al-Qaeda member turned leader turned Syrian leader, Ahmed al-Shara. We know that, ever since the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad back in December, we had Israel come in. They immediately occupied more territory in Syria. They were immediately bombing all across the country, trying to target Syria's defenses in any way possible. And all of a sudden we see al-Shara coming out and calling out Israel for what seems to be the first time. And then you have Israel responding this week with even more bombing, claiming it's part of a new policy ensuring a demilitarized southern Syria. What do you make of this latest escalation and the fact that we're hearing anything from this new sort of proxy Syrian government calling out Israel in any way?
In order to analyze what's happening now in Syria, I would like just to give historical context for your respected audience. 110 years ago, Arabs were used to live under the Ottoman Empire, right? And the Brits wanted to weaken the Ottoman Empire, so they communicated with the Arabic leaders, and they encouraged them to revolt against the Ottoman Empire, promising them that if you revolt against the Ottoman Empire, then we will give you the United Arab Nation with one leadership. And back then, this communique was between McMahon, who was in Egypt, the British ruler, and the Sharif Hussein in the Levant. And Sharif Hussein and his sons, they organized a revolution against the Ottoman Empire, and they were successful. And this has eventually led, during the World War I, for the eventual withdrawal of the Ottoman Empire from Syria. But once the Ottoman Empire withdrew from Syria, what have the Brits done, basically? The Brits had a secret agreement with the French back then called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And under these agreements, they have divided the region into spheres of influence between the French and the Brits. Syria came under the rule of the French, the Lebanon is the same, and the Palestine was in the hands of the Brits. And in parallel, the Brits have also given the Balfour promise, or the Balfour Declaration, in order to establish a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. All this was happening without the knowledge of the Arabs, basically. So the imperialists have conspired against the Arabs, asked them to revolt against the rulers, back then the Ottomans, and then once the rulers were gone, they have came and occupied the country. And when I want to draw parallels between this incident and Syria, Syrians also revolted against their ruler, and they were promised freedom, they were promised democracy, they were promised prosperity, and they were given all sorts of aid and all sorts of, I'm not talking about ordinary people, I'm talking about the people who carried out the fight, the insurgency against the former Assad government. They have received billions of dollars. Of course, we have to say the CIA spent $1 billion per year in Syria to arm and train these insurgents, including the people who fought alongside Jolani, who is now the leader of Syria. In addition to the soft power, which the US used, for example, via the USAID spent over $15 billion in 10% of the Syrian territory where Jolani used to occupy. So imagine how much money they dumped in a very small area where around 3 million, 4 million people live. And they have all enabled the next revolt and the upcoming leadership of Syria under the leadership of Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. Now they call him Ahmad Shara. But this rebranding from Abu Muhammad al-Jolani to Ahmad al-Shara is, again, it's for media purposes, because they want to separate between his former ISIS and Al-Qaeda identity and the current one, as if now he has become a civilized. So under such circumstances, of course, Israel took the opportunity to destroy all the strategic weaponry of Syria, the air defenses, ballistic missiles, the navy, the tanks and everything, and advanced inside Syrian territories and occupied Mount Hermon. Now, once you occupy Mount Hermon, this is the highest hill between Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel. Therefore, now Israel enjoys the superiority, military superiority over 3 regions, basically, including Syria. Now, any American artillery howitzer over Mount Hermon can bomb Damascus, because Damascus is 20 kilometers away, and the howitzer can bomb to 25 kilometers. So Damascus, after the regime change in Syria, in my opinion, has fallen already in the hands of the Israelis, tactically and militarily. But Netanyahu wants to expand this now. He declared that the Jolani forces cannot come to the south of Damascus, and he will create a demilitarized zone in 4 governorates, including Quneitira, where Mount Hermon is located, in Sueda, where the Druze minority mostly live. We have Daraa as well, which is overwhelmingly populated by Sunni Muslims. And therefore, the borders of Israel eventually stretched, or let's say practically stretched to Damascus. Now, if Jolani's forces cannot come to the south of Damascus, it means Israel's borders have stretched to Damascus. And in my opinion, this is what Israel always does. Like in the 6-day war, after 67 war, they have occupied the Golan Heights. They said this is just a buffer zone because we want to protect ourselves from our enemies. But now this buffer zone is stretched to Al Quneitira, and it is stretching to other regions in Syria, including Daraa and the Sueda. And this will mean that in a year or two, basically Netanyahu will say, now the threat is coming from Damascus against our newly annexed territories. And remember, Smotrich said clearly, our greater Israel borders stretch from Jerusalem to Damascus. So they're eyeing on Damascus. And they will, like the other day I was talking to Patrick Henningsen, and he mentioned something very brilliant. He said, look, Kevork, in 1982, Ariel Sharon was drinking tea in Beirut, and he was rolling into Beirut and wandering in the streets with no resistance. And he said, now the job of Netanyahu will be even more easier to roll in Damascus in less than 48 hours. If now Netanyahu wants, he can occupy it. But this was the reason why they wanted Jolani to come to power, because of 2 major reasons. One, Jolani is a Takfiri terrorist. He was an ISIS, he was an Al-Qaeda. And whoever wanted for Jolani to come to power, they knew that he cannot govern over the Syrian people, which is multi-ethnic and multi-religious. And he will impose his Takfiri ideology over the people, right? So the minorities here, or ethnic and religious minorities, will say, I don't want to live under this rule. And everybody will start thinking in a narrow way, in a more Like, my identity is no longer Syrian. I'm a Druze. I'm an Alawite. I'm a Kurdish. So they are dividing the country vertically among these ethnic and religious minorities, well knowing that Jolani will do that. And this prepares the way for the geographical partition of Syria, and that is the Balkanization of Syria, which Israel wants. And they are speaking about it every day now. They say, the Israeli officials and Israeli influencers, they want for the Druze to live with the Israelis, and they want to open a corridor between the Golan Heights, the Sueda, all the way to the eastern shore of the Euphrates, in order to open this communication between the Kurds, the Druze, and Israel. So they're talking about the partition of Syria, and under such circumstances, when Jolani poses an existential threat against the Alawites and the Christians as well, because he's every day attacking Alawite towns and cities in the coast, it's only a matter of time for the Alawites also to say, my existence is under jeopardy and I cannot live with him. And we gave up our weapons because the Alawites have surrendered their weapons, and they believe Jolani that he will treat them fairly. But now they see that this treatment is not really fair. Therefore, sooner or later, you will see calls also from the Alawite community saying, like, we have had enough. We want to join the Druze and the Alawites in asking for either partition, separation, or certain level of federalism.
Wow, that's so interesting. And I'm glad that you bring up not only the historical context, but also where all of these different factions stand, because that's one of the things when looking at the overthrow of Assad just a couple of months ago, I was going, okay, so you have all of these different identities and religions within Syria, and they were able to coexist. But as you're noting there, this plan by Israel, right, to come in and to break everyone up and to kind of make everyone go into their own specific provinces and to then target Syria that way, it's like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I can see how they've been building up to this point. Now, I'm also curious too when it comes to the role that Turkey plays in all of this, right? Obviously, they were the ones who backed and supported al-Jolani and his, reformed al-Qaeda government, however you want to describe it. So they're happy with, him coming into power. And it was interesting. We're starting to see more statements coming from Turkey complaining about Israel. But when I look at Turkey, I go, okay, they say plenty of the, politically correct things, quote unquote, when it comes to Israel and calling them out, but they never actually do anything. So how do you view the role that Turkey is playing right now, what they're going to allow, and are they in it with Israel to a certain extent? Because, they'd also like some Syrian territory and really any excuse to keep going against the Kurds.
If there is any Syrian listening to this conversation, I have to tell them the truth about this, and that is the regime change against Syria, which was initiated in 2011 and then it was put on the shelf in 2018. In 2024, when it was activated again, this was a joint Israeli-Turkish operation against Syria. They have coordinated and cooperated together in order to continue the regime change and coup Assad and make him flee the country. Turkey wanted to do that because Assad rejected to reconcile with him and accept the 3 million refugees in areas that Turkey will occupy. So Turks didn't want to withdraw from Syria, and Assad said no. So there were lots of issues that Assad rejected. So the Turks had the embedded interest or the invested interest to kick him out from power. But for Israel, this was a strategic victory for Israel as well, because when October 7 happened and Hezbollah intervened in support of the Palestinians of Gaza, the priority of Israel was to decouple the front lines of Gaza and southern Lebanon. And Hezbollah said no, they have rejected it. And after several rejections, Israel decapitated the leadership of Hezbollah to force them to decouple from southern Lebanon. During this time, when there were talks about ceasefire agreement in Lebanon after decapitation of the leadership, the Jordanian foreign minister came to Syria and delivered an Israeli-American message to Assad that he has to participate in the potential ceasefire agreement in Lebanon by sieging Hezbollah. So you have to cut the supply chains. When you do that, we accept you. If you don't do that, we will come after you. And Assad rejected that offer, and the regime change started a few days after this offer. So Israel and Turkey had an interest in Syria. But what happens after the regime change? This is the who would take the bigger slice of the cake in Syria, right? So this is what's the struggle is happening now. Where are the borders? Are Turkey going to continue occupying Damascus or not? This is the issue. Israel doesn't mind Turkey occupying Aleppo, Idlib, Homs, but beyond that, in Damascus, Israelis do not want for Turkey to be present there. And practically speaking, Jolani is the intelligence construct of Turkey. He has been groomed and supported from NATO Turkey. So in this case, Israel wants to demilitarize southern Syria, in addition, later to kick the Jolani out of Damascus. And it's easy for Israel to sell the war against Damascus by saying there is a terrorist occupying Damascus. And this was one of the reasons why they wanted him to come to power, because it's difficult to normalize someone like Jolani in the eyes of the Israeli government. They wanted him to coup Assad, but they wanted him not to stay in power for a long time. They wanted him to come and create this existential threat against the minority so that everyone comes into separation from each other based on vertical lines, and then they would get rid of him. So I think that the role of Jolani has been to achieve these goals, basically. And now we are in a serious situation where Turkey and Israel will decide the fate of Damascus and what is beyond. I think